The Introduction to the Zend Avesta, Part 3 of 3, Vyasna, Visparad, Ephragon, Gahas, and Miscellaneous Fragments by, it doesn't say the date on it, but, L.H. Mills. Many readers for whom the Zend Avesta possesses only collateral interest may not understand why any introductory remarks are called for to those portions of it which are treated in this volume. The extent of the matter does not appear at first sight a sufficient reason for adding a word to the masterly work which introduces the first 2 volumes, and, in fact, save as regards questions which bear upon the Gathas, I avoid for the most part, for the present, all discussion of details which chiefly concern either the sections treated in the first 2 volumes, or the extended parts of the latter Avesta treated here. But the Gathas are of such a nature, and differ so widely from other parts of the Avesta, that some words of separate discussion seem quite indispensable, and such a discussion was recommended by the author of the other volumes. A second reason why a word of introduction is necessary when the translation of the successive parts of the Avesta passes from one hand to another is a reason which bears upon the subject with exceptional force. It is this: the Avesta, while clearly made out so far as the requirements of comparative theology are concerned, yet presents difficulties as to minute details so great that as yet no 2 independent scholars can entirely agree as to their solution. Master and pupil, friend and friend, must differ, and sometimes on questions of no trivial amount. Now, if the path being spoken about is their actual spiritual path, they can fully agree on all the matters, and there's going to be differences in how they think or act about it. But, that doesn't have to result in sects for people, or for people to deny their different understandings. The preliminary studies requisite to the formation of ultimate opinions are so varied and of such a nature, involving the rendering of matter as yet totally unrendered with any scientific exactness in either India or Europe, that no person can claim to have satisfied himself in these respects. Scholars are therefore obliged to advance, biased by the fact that they are preponderatingly erroneous, are preponderatingly Vedist, and therefore certain at the outset they must differ to a certain degree from each other, and to a certain degree also from the truth. It was also, as might well be understood without statement, with a full knowledge of the fact that I was inclined to allow a special weight to a comparison with Veda, that I modified the evidence of tradition somewhat more than he did. The Professor Bermestetter urged me to accept this task. Preponderatingly, I'm not saying that word right. But while I am constrained to say something by way of a preparatory treatise here, a sense of the fitness of things induces me to be as brief as possible, and I must therefore ask indulgence of the reader if my mode of expressing myself seems either rough or abrupt. I personally have issue with making translations because I want to convey as much of the meaning as possible and some other stuff, and it's understandable to me. I don't need as many words to describe things as other people might. So, part of the reason why I don't do my own translation of these things. And as to what the Gathas are in their detail, enough has been said in the summaries and notes. From those representations, necessarily somewhat scattered, it appears that they comprise 17 sections of poetical matter, equal in extent to about 25 to 30 hymns of the Rig Veda, composed in ancient Aryan meters, ascribing supreme, beneficent power to the deity Ahura Mazda, who is yet opposed coordinately by an evil entity called Akamana. See, they don't really consider Angra or Angra Ma'inu. Well, Akamana was lower in the hierarchy than Angra Ma'inu. In all respects, save in the one particular, that he is not the creator of this evil deity, Zervanism, and does not possess the power to destroy him or his realm. This Ahura Mazda is one of the purest conceptions which had yet been produced. He has 6 personified attributes, so one might state it. Later, but not in the Gathas, described as archangels, Vishaspentas, while in the Gathas they are at once the abstract attributes of God, or of God's faithful adherents upon earth, and at the same time conceived as persons. All efforts to separate the instances in which they are spoken of as mere dispositions of the divine or saintly mind, and those in which they are spoken of as personal beings, having been in vain. Now, I guess you can much later, but one of the easiest places to make this sort of point I'm about to make is in the Shemhem Barash. You start with this 3-letter name of God. You have the light being the response to it, and then you have the counter creation entity. So 72, 72, 72. It's a system. Well, that's a balanced system, so that kind of compares more to this. We have, therefore, a profound scheme, perhaps not consciously invented, but being a growth through centuries. And the system is the unity of God in his faithful creatures. It is not a polytheism properly so called, as Ahura forms with his immortals, a heptade, reminding one of the Sabellian Trinity. It is not a pantheism, for it is especially arrested by the domain of the evil entity, a deity in the Western way of thinking. It might be called, if we stretch the indications, a hagiotheism, a delineation of God in the holy creation. Well, most, actual monotheism, you could say, is God has, that same formula. God has attributes, and those attributes are known through angels. And there's forces of this material world that we, things that go on here, whether we know anything spiritual or not, we know of these attributes. And this responds to the demons who would try to do otherwise. Outside of the heptade is Sra'asha, the personified obedience, and possibly Vayu, as once mentioned, and as the emblem of the pious, is the kind soul, while the fire is a poetically personified symbol of the divine purity and power. The fire wasn't their god, it's a principle that reminds people, but as opposed to the good God, we have the evil mind, or the angry spirit, not yet provided with full personified attributes to correspond to the bountiful immortals. He has, however, a servant, Eshma, the impersonation of invasion and rapine, the chief scourge of the Zarathustrians, and an evil angel, the Drug, personified deceit, while the Devas, asuras in the Vedic language, of their more southern neighbors, some of whose tribes had remained as servile castes among the Zarathustrians, constitute perhaps the general representatives of Akamena, Eshma, the Drug, etc. The true original spirits unite in the creation of the good and evil existence, both actually in the present and in principles which have their issue in the future in rewards and punishments. The importance of this creed, so far stated as the dualistical creation and as an attempted solution of the hardest problem of speculation, should be obvious to every intelligent eye, every enlightened eye. If there existed a supreme God whose power could undo the very laws of life, no evil could have been known, but the doctrine denies that there is any such being. The good and evil in existence limit each other. There can be no happiness undefined by sorrow, no goodness which does not resist sin. Accordingly, the evil principle is recognized and so necessary that it is represented by an evil entity. His very name, however, is a thought or a passion, while the good deity is not responsible for the wickedness and grief which prevail. His power itself could not have prevented their occurrence, and he alone has an especially objective name, and one which could only be aligned to a person. These suggestions, whether true or false, are certainly some of the most serious that have ever been made, and we find them originally here. I didn't see any. No, 11. One of the things that we should really sort of look at is the way they talked about Zarathustra, Zoroastrianism, is really the way of the Yatus, the Yazidi, that sort of thing. Well, you understand what I mean. But so in the Athena'am, April 12th, 1884, and the Academy, September 13th, 1884, on the entire subject of the connection with the Gnostic and modern philosophies, any special labors have included a much longer period of time than that mentioned on page 4. Haug Long since called attention to the likeness of Hegelianism to the page 20 chief ideas in the Zarathustrian philosophy as centering in dualism, and I think that it is quite evident, and I believe conceded by experts, the Hegelian sublated dualism is a descendant of the Zarathustrian through the Gnostics and Jacob Boehme. And in a way, isn't it like a term, kind of like what people say Hinduism? It's like, well, it happened over here. And so anybody who used these elements of the cosmology, whatever their interpretation, people were saying, oh, they're Zoroastrian. At least they throw in Zoroaster the prophet, but it's kind of like definitions of Sufism. Is the person Muslim? Is the person not Muslim? Well, it depends on which one. And in Zoroastrianism, we have so much of it. We have almost everything that was at some point lost. And certain revivals have changed things, while making things available at the same time, are known. As to the nature of religious rewards and punishments, we have suggestions scarcely less important in the eye of scientific theology, and, as a matter of fact, very much more extensively spread, to say that the future rewards held out in the Gathas were largely, if not chiefly, spiritual, and in the man himself, would be almost a slur upon the truth. The truth is that the mental heaven and hell with which we are now familiar as the only future states recognized by intelligent people, and thoughts which, in spite of their familiarity, can never lose their importance, are not only used and expressed in the Gathas, but expressed there. So far as we are aware, for the first time, while mankind were delivered up to the childish terrors of a future replete with horrors visited upon them from without, the early Iranian sage announced the eternal truth that the rewards of heaven and the punishments of hell can only be from within. He gave us, we may fairly say, through the system which he has influenced, that chief doctrine of subjective recompense, which must work an essential change in the mental habits of everyone who receives it. Now, monotheism rather than Christian polytheism focuses on exacting, and as much as the Bible does ask people to be righteous too, that's kind of the vicarious atonement and certain doctrines with that kind of take the edge off of righteousness, you could say. Although you do find more of a higher amount of righteousness, you could say, among the Christians than you do the people without a path. But after the creation of souls and the establishment of the laws which should govern them, Aramaete gives a body, and men and angels begin their careers. A Matra is inspired for the guidance of the well-disposed. The faithful learns the vows of the holy system under the teaching of the immortals, while the infidel and reprobate person of mankind accept the seductions of the worst mind. Now, misbeliever is probably the most accurate. Disbeliever will be included amongst that. Infidel, well, if they're faithful to another way, I don't like this Christian way of calling people infidels. And unite with the Da'ivas, as in the capital sin of warfare from wanton cruelty or for dishonest acquisition. The consequence of this latter alliance is soon apparent. The kind, as representative of the holy people, laments under the miseries which make Iranian life a load. The efforts to draw livelihood from the honest laborers are opposed, but not frustrated, by the Da'iva worshipping tribes, who still struggle with Zarathustrians for the control of the territory. The kind therefore lifts her wail to Ahura and his righteous order, Asha, who respond by the appointment of Zarathustra as the individual entrusted with her redemption, and he, accepting his commission, begins his prophetic labors. From this on, we have a series of lamentations, prayers, praises, and exhortations addressed by Zarathustra and his immediate associates to Ahura and the people, which delineate the public and personal sorrows in detail, utter individual supplications and thanksgivings, and exhort the masses assembled in special or periodical meetings. Now, one of the things that we can look at with some of this is that, you know what primates do. Humans are primates. Well, a type of primate. Primates arrange by hierarchy. So we're using what they call Zoroastrianism uses the hierarchy, you could say, and involves itself in the hierarchy to worship God. Now, again, if you go back to towards some of the others, they didn't. The angels themselves weren't worshipped. This wasn't the forces of nature weren't worshipped. The fire wasn't worshipped. So you can go back and say, well, it wasn't worship as a god. This English word just like when you say in a lodge, the worshipful master, it's not, you're not declaring these people gods, you know. We're confessing respect. Or here, it must be noted that the population among whom these hymns were composed were chiefly agriculturalists and herdsmen, circumstances which affected their interest as such were, of course, paramount with them, and as their land and cattle represented their most valuable property, whatever threatened them was the most of all things to be dreaded. Accordingly, rapine and the raid, whether coming from Turanians or Da'eva worshippers, were regarded as the most terrible of visitations, but their mortal earnestness in their determination to avoid rapine on their part, even when tempted by a desire for retaliation, is especially to be noted. And we see what's going on in some countries in Asia and Africa and stuff like this, particularly some of the countries that, at least one of the countries, I'm not sure how bad things are going to be when this video comes out, but at least one of the countries where it's said that, you know, there's two countries where it said that Zarathustra originated. He certainly did his mission in this country. They don't like foreign invaders. You know, they want, you know, and foreign invaders have never, you know, really proved themselves to be better for their country. So what do people expect? Now visitors, you know, back before certain things happened, or, you know, you could travel alone really, and be safer than some of people's own countries, like my country. It's, you know, but then afterwards you couldn't even as a citizen travel, you know, with any reliable safety without, you know, being part of some convoy or something. It was as awful when regarded as a sin as it was when suffered as an affliction, and their animus in this particular was the most exceptional. While the above facts explain to us, on the one hand, the principal entities, I could say, because people's use, you know, not everybody mentions an entity. It's like, you know, you can mention the sun, but without worshiping the sun, although people do make prostrations to the sun, so that particular yoga practice is, obviously, they're treating the sun as a god. And the particular hopes and fears which inspired their worship, they lead us also, on the other hand, to wonder the more, that so subtle a theology as we found expressed in the documents should have arisen amid so simple a community. Now, as we go on, if people are worshiping the entity of this and that of the other, I'm not going to deny that was done, but that the water itself, or the fire itself, or the earth itself was treated as a god, that's kind of going too far with the interpretation. In the course of the recitations, we have special intimations of an organized struggle of the Da'eva, partly to overwhelm the Zarathustrians. At times they seem very nearly to have accomplished their object. A distinct reference to a battle in these lines occurs, which sanguinary violence is alluded to more than once, as in the line "are in skirmish." We conclude from the prevalence of a thankful tone that the Zarathustrians gained the upper hand during the Gathic period. But although the result may have been assured, the struggle at the time of the last Gatha was by no means over. In latest Gatha, as in the earliest, we have signs of fierce and bloody conflict. The same type of existence prevailed greatly later. in the time of the Yasts, but the scene seems very different, and Zarathustra's human characteristics are wholly lost in the mythical attributes with which time and superstition had abundantly provided him. By way, then, of summarizing the chief characteristics of his original system, we may say that he and his companions were struggling to establish a kingdom under the sovereign power of God, whose first care was to relieve suffering and shelter the honest and industrious poor. This kingdom was to be conducted according to his holy order or plan of salvation, to be permeated by living piety, and with the ultimate object of bestowing both weal, W-E-A-L, and immortality. This high ideal was also not left as an abstract principle to work its way. Society was far too rudimental, then as ever, for the efficient survival of unsupported principles. A compact hierarchical system seems to have existed, a sacramental object being the fire, before which a priesthood officiated with unwavering zeal. And see, that's where some of the things inserted that was the problem in the first place, is that wanted to put the just like the Messiah to the Jesus story, wanted to get the priestly authority into the hands of the people, and make things doable by everybody. But the traces of this are very restricted in the Gathas, and according to all probability, it was greatly less elaborated at their period than later. Well, the manuscript evidence and otherwise shows, the fight against the over-ritualization and stuff like this built, obviously, as time went on. Such, in very brief outline, is the system which meets us as Zarathustrianism in that period of Mazda worship when Zarathustra lived and composed the Gathic hymns. As to the further question, who was Zarathustra, and when and where did he live, diversity of opinions still prevails, so much so that as regards it, I differ slightly even from my eminent friend and predecessor. As such differences on the subject of Avesta are, however, matters of course, I freely state my impressions. Who was then the person, if any person corresponding to the name of Zarathustra in the Gathas? Did he exist, and was he really the author of these ancient hymns? That he existed as a historical person, I have already affirmed. And as to the hymns ascribed to him and his immediate associates, I have also no hesitation. Parts of these productions may have been interpolated, but the Gathas as a whole show great unity, and the interpolations are made in the spirit of the original, and that Zarathustra was the name of the individual in which this unity centers, we have no sufficient reason to dispute. The name is mentioned in the most sacred connections, as well as those which depict the reality of the prophet's sufferings, and there is no reason at all why it should have come down endeared to humanity, unless it belonged to one who, in the presence of a sovereign and a kingdom, could impress his personality with greatly more defined distinctness upon his contemporaries than either that sovereign or any of his adherents. That any forgery is present in the Gathas, any desire to palm off doctrines upon the sacred community in the name of the great prophet, as in the Vendidad and later Yasna, is quite out of the question. The Gathas are genuine in their mass, as I believe no scholar anywhere now questions. Now, if you compare it to the biblical tradition, certainly there's reason to think that it's preserved better. And I missed some of the notes here. Okay. So, the visitations from the raiders. So, when this happened, they prayed against Eshma without qualification. They may practice desolating havoc in the time of war, but the raid, as in times of nominal peace, seems to have been foreign to them. The practical operation of the prime principle of, taking care of the poor seems to have been, at times, beneficial to a remarkable, if not unparalleled, extent. Under the Sassanian, the lower classes enjoyed great protection. See also the remarks of Professor Wallington, The Seventh Oriental Monarchy, page 440. Also recall the extraordinary treatment of the poor during the drought and famine under Perozes. The account is, however, exaggerated, and Professor Wallington cites it on page 314. Here, for the characteristics of this great teacher, I refer to the hymns themselves, which stand alone of their kind, and in literature. Nowhere at their period had there been a human voice, so far as we have any evidence, which uttered thoughts like these. They are now, some of them, the great commonplaces of philosophical religion, but till then they were unheard of. Augusta. Yet many say of Zarathustra, as of our first announcers, that while he antedates all whose records have come down to us, he was probably only the last physical link in a far extended chain. His system, like those of his predecessors and successors, was a growth. His main conceptions had been surmised, although not spoken before. His world was ripe for them, and when he appeared, he had only to utter and develop them. I would not call him a reformer. He does not repudiate his predecessors. Well, he kind of does. That's sort of the purpose of a prophetic figure, but it's not because, well, the other, it's just to refine what is, slough off what's not true and that sort of thing. The old Aryan entities retire before the spiritual Ahura, but I did not think that he especially intended to discredit them. One of the inferior ones is mentioned here for a moment, but the great benevolence, order, and power, together with their results in the human subject, Ahura's piety, incarnate in men, and their weal and immortality, as a consequence, crowd out all other thoughts. His mental insight is as evident from his system as his deep moral inspirations. As to his second characteristics, his manner of thought and expression, we find them peculiar to the last degree. He has given us writings in which every syllable seems loaded with thought, sometimes much repeated, and to us of the present day very familiar, but then, when he wrote, one would suppose he intended to utter his dark speech, as the Bible would have phrased it.